Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Today, we are releasing an episode the Thursday before the NFL Super Bowl. It's by far the biggest sporting event in the United States of America, domestically speaking. And we have a very, very special guest today. Nancy Armour, USA Today sports columnist, is going to be walking us through the ins and outs of the social impact of the NFL and maybe some other U.S. sports. So that's how it intertwines with politics, with culture, with everything of the sort. So Nancy, first off, we want to welcome you and thank you for joining us tonight.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be joining you guys.
So Nancy, I feel like we should kind of lay everything out, and I'd love to get your thought on this. In my mind, we have two ends of the spectrum here. So we have the shut up and dribble, Laura Ingraham, who views sports, and her ilk, who views sports as being almost siloed off from society. These folks are athletes. They're here to play the game. They're here to look at the scoreboard and nothing else. And then on the other hand, you have folks like Ken Burns, who, for our listeners, created this 20-hour plus long documentary about how the sport of baseball evolved with America over 100 years, and they're intertwined, and there's a lot of great symbiosis. Where do you fit in on the spectrum of how sports and just culture interact here in the United States?
Yeah. Well, and first of all, I would like to point out that the people who claim that they don't want sports and politics to mix, they don't want sports and politics that they don't like to mix. So, it's okay to have like the flyovers and honor guards and color guards and, massive American flags and all that. All of that's fine. It's when you get into the touchy, social cultural issues that they don't like that you're supposed to shut up and dribble. But that's an aside. I have always said that, and I believe that sports is the prism through which we view society. If you look at really any of the big moments that we've had in our country, they have been preceded by something in sports. Civil rights movement preceded by Jackie Robinson, equal rights for women, equal rights amendment, equal pay, Billie Jean King. Even the conversation around the AIDS and HIV epidemic changed almost, it might not be fair to say overnight, but it changed dramatically after Magic Johnson came out and said that he was HIV positive. What happens on these playing fields is a reflection of our life in general. It's almost a way of working out how we feel about certain issues, or athletes are allowing us to work out how we feel about certain issues. And then eventually the rest of the world catches up to what's going on sports fields, in locker rooms, that type of thing. So I think it's impossible to separate them. I don't think we should separate them. And I think we've reached a point that athletes are not going to allow us to separate them because they have recognized that they have a voice, they've got a platform, and they want to use it. And most of them use it quite effectively.
Nancy, when we talk about player-athlete advocacy, we often look at these progressive examples, the examples that we might see as positive examples from the history books. Jackie Robinson, who you mentioned, Bill Russell, Muhammad Ali. And in today's world, there's a recent example of Colin Kaepernick, and in the UK, Marcus Rashford. But there is also a darker side to this. I mean, we've had athletes in the past and also today who have advocated social positions that we might not view as positive or progressive.
Sure.
In recent times, for example, we've heard from Aaron Rodgers and Kyrie Irving about vaccines in a way that probably was not productive for American public health. We heard from Kyrie Irving conspiracy theories about the Holocaust. We also have a history of homophobia in sports. We have a history of athletes who have been ambivalent about domestic violence at best. So on balance, how do we really kind of evaluate the impact that athletes have had on American life largely? It is a more complicated picture than it might appear when we only look at the examples we want to remember.
Sure. And I think that there is truth to that. But I think those examples are much smaller or fewer than what we see generally, and I'm thinking of the summer of 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement. The WNBA players basically flipped control of the Senate by getting out the vote and getting out the word on Raphael Warnock, and defeating Kelly Loeffler, who had been the Atlanta Dream's owner and was critical of the players' speaking out against bias policing and unjust killings of Black and brown people. So I think athletes tend, by and large, reflect that. And I think it's also somewhat dependent on sports. Like if you talk to a lot of baseball players, you are not going to get a lot of, people signing up for get out the vote, leading that charge. That's just not the culture in baseball. Most of the athletes who were resistant to the vaccines, a lot of them came from baseball. So I think it might be more sport related as opposed to, that it's just like a silent, I don't want to say a majority, but that there's this silent group of people who don't agree with the progressives. Yes. Are there people here and there? Of course there are. That's all walks of life. But I think if you're talking about the players in the NFL, the players in the NBA, the players in the WNBA, the players in the NWSL, I think they all tend to be more on the progressive side than the other side.
Yeah. And Nancy, I was a college baseball player and played in the NECBL, which is, a pretty good college all-star league. Mm-hmm. And I experienced what you just said. Most all, if not all of the players on my team were very conservative, socially conservative. And it was rather shocking growing up in New Hampshire and going to a boarding school to be then just thrown into this environment where everybody is, we were young kids, but folks were using like homophobic slurs as parlance, right? Just talking back and forth. And it was not even anything that is thought of. And I want to know why we have this difference between, we don't even need to look at baseball, which tends to be super white Americans or foreign players, but why maybe is there a difference between the players in the NFL and the way that they view social issues and the players in the NBA, where a lot of the leaders in the NBA are super outspoken?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've thought about that before. And for baseball, part of it is I've hit on geography, that a lot of players come from southern states, which, as we know, tend to trend more conservative. I also think it has to do with the leaders of the sport. As you said, if you go from Bill Russell to Kareem to LeBron, I mean, you have this very clear line that, the biggest, we skipped it a little bit with Jordan, obviously, but you have the biggest name in the sport is very active socially, is very committed to improving the world beyond the basketball court. And so I think it not only sets an example for other players, it gives permission to other players too. If LeBron is speaking out, if LeBron is being critical of, the former president of the United States, the seventh player on the, Sacramento Kings roster, it feels more emboldened to say it too, because they're not a voice speaking in the wilderness. You've got the greatest player, of his generation, a player who is a crossover celebrity. You have him speaking out. So you're not going to be calling attention to yourself, for lack of a better term. And I think we saw that play out a little bit with the NFL too. Kaepernick was a quarterback. And then that's a very different thing for a quarterback to say something as opposed to a running back. Now, granted, Cap ended up getting blackballed, but then you had other players behind him, a Malcolm Jenkins, Chris Long, Devin McCourty. You had these other guys whose voice added to the chorus. So again, it gives permission for other players to say, okay, well, I'm going to give my opinion, or, conversely for some, probably I'm not going to give my opinion. And, I think one thing that we did see too was you had at one point Aaron Rodgers spoke up and said, yes, what has happened to people of color in this country is awful. And maybe he wasn't protesting, but he was supporting their right to do so and criticizing the people who were criticizing the players.
So John and I both grew up in New Hampshire. I went to a boarding school in New Hampshire. Even in New Hampshire, on the baseball teams, when you get old enough to be in high school, it is overwhelmingly conservative. So that's like a purple state, not the South. I don't know the answer to the question, but it was very weird to me. And every time John and I discuss it with other folks, I'm like, baseball is arguably the most conservative sport here. Yeah. And I can't answer why. So it's interesting. I think the geography point has a lot of salience though.
I want to mention another sport too that hasn't come up yet in this discussion, which is golf, which by some measures is could be considered the fourth most popular sport in the U.S. rather than ice hockey. I'm not really sure, but certainly recreationally, it's a lot more significant than some of the sports, the team sports we think of as being so big. And that's a professional sport where the players tend to have conservative political views. And Nancy, I also appreciated the little shot you made there at Michael Jordan, who is a figure that is probably too infrequently criticized. But speaking of Michael Jordan, I want to kind of draw our attention to another aspect of this. We're talking a lot about the culture among players and the kind of responsibility among players and the leadership roles that players have chosen to step into. But the most important stakeholders in a lot of these sports leagues are the owners. And that's a group that Michael Jordan has now become part of himself. Mm-hmm. Nancy, how big of a factor in this difference between NBA player social activism and NFL player social activism is actually due to differences in the attitudes and positions that the owners have taken on these issues and on the concept of free speech on political issues in general?
It's massive. The owners are the ones who set the tone. And I think it goes deeper than that going back to David Stern, the former NBA commissioner, he viewed the players and the owners as more of a partnership, that they were in this together, that they had to work together in order to grow the league, in order to make it, there was a time in the mid to late 70s that the NBA was on life support. People forget about that given its popularity now. But when Magic and Bird were coming into the league, it was, there were some real struggles. And I think the league recognized that they needed to work with the players in order to make it a successful league. So when the players have said, we're going to, the Miami Heat, we're going to wear hoodies to honor Trayvon Martin. We want this, we're not going to play games during the bubble after the shootings in Kenosha with the Milwaukee Bucks. Owners are much more willing to work in partnership with the players. You're not going to see that in the NFL, because the NFL, the owners are the owners and the players are their employees. They don't see them. They might talk a good game and say, oh yeah, we're partners, but they don't see it that way. The players work for them, and the owners are the ones who set the tone, set the rules. And it is largely, there's one person of color who is a majority owner of a team, Shad Khan. You have, I think, a half dozen women who are the principal owners of the teams. It is largely a white, a club of white men and conservative white men. So when the players are protesting and saying, we want to affect this kind of change and this kind of change, you're going to get pushback from that group. And again, they don't see it as needing to work in concert with the players or being partners with the players. You've got some owners who do, but by and large, they don't see a need to do this, and so they're not going to do this.
Hard to, in my opinion, come up with a policy when you don't have someone's opposing view while you are trying to create policy. So the owners have decided this is what the right choice is. Marcellus, your reaction?
Look, the NFL made a mess of this entire issue, and now they're trying to clean it up, and unfortunately, they've fallen short. They could have taken some leadership from the NBA and Major League Baseball in terms of how to make this policy, which was, in the NBA, you have to stand for the anthem. So simply that there. But now they're trying to serve two gods, because they want to respect the freedom of expression, the protesters, but at the same time protect their bottom line. What's going to happen now is there's going to be a moment what we're going to see in the fall. And there's going to be a big name player of notice who's not on the field to play when an anthem is going on. So now this same issue that you think you bottled up is all of a sudden going to come back to the surface, because what do we say then when a big name athlete and star is in the locker room in protest for the same issue?
But they're saying that they don't have to be. So why is that going to be an issue?
Well, he's saying that if Tom Brady, for instance, isn't on the field, everyone's going to be like, what happened to Tom Brady? Why wasn't he out there for the anthem?
Same thing as last year.
But the thing that I'm going to push back on you is that I'm surprised you didn't say that they didn't. The main thing the NBA does when it comes up with these policies is consult with the Players Association.
Yeah.
That's the misstep. Whatever the policy is, if the players have some input on it, then everybody's bought in.
So Nancy, I want to dig into this a little bit deeper. We saw a couple years back the Major League Baseball moved the All-Star game away from Georgia due to voting rights legislation. And the rumors were, I don't know if this was ever confirmed, that Major League Baseball was concerned about a player backlash, not one player, but players that would refuse to play, maybe sit out games. And in the NBA, on the other side of the ledger, you had Kyrie Irving feel secure enough not to get vaccinated and sit out, I think, half or 3/4 of a season because he knew his paycheck was going to come. And in baseball and in basketball, you have these guaranteed contracts. Whereas in football, largely speaking, with maybe one or two notable exceptions, you don't have guaranteed contracts for the entire league. So I was wondering if we could dig in a little bit. How much is the power dynamic between the basketball players and their owners and the difference that we see between the NFL owners and their players driven by this lack of guaranteed contract?
That's huge. And it's a great point that you bring up. If you are an NBA player and you have a, catastrophic injury or they bring in a new coach and you don't fit in the coach's playing style, they still have to pay your contract. They can cut you, but they're still going to have to pay you. Whereas in the NFL, if you're cut, the money stops. Like you said, you might get your signing bonus up front, but the checks stop coming as soon as you are cut. And so there's been a lot of thought over the years that has stopped some players from speaking out, that they're not going to take that risk because of the financial risk to themselves, to their family, because their careers are so short. And the owners also know that, there is some, I don't want to say inhumanity, but I think that they look at the players much more as parts of their business as opposed to human beings, because they are so replaceable. You cut a quarterback one day and you've got another guy coming in the door as the first one's going out. You could be, the joke was with the Dallas kicker when he was having some issues that, how long is it going to be before they're bringing kickers in? And it's the dog eat dog world of the NFL. And yeah, I think that plays a big role in it too. And again, it's that the owners don't see the players as their partners. They see them as pieces of their franchise, of their industry, but not full partners, not even half partners.
So I want to even dig a little bit further into that owner mentality that we're talking about. I would characterize it as almost a cabal, a very dark side. And the NFL in our recent history has had a lot of bad things that they have done and covered up, from potentially knowing about CTE, which for our audience is a very severe degenerative brain disease, largely caused by hits to the head from football. That's oversimplification, but it's not good. And I think 99%, Nancy, of the brains that there were autopsies on showed that they had this form of CTE. The NFL doesn't pay their players that are retired healthcare benefits for being modern day gladiators. You mentioned they colluded against Colin Kaepernick. I promise I won't list it all off. There's more. Jerry Jones and his, opposition to kneeling, Daniel Snyder. We could go on and on and on. I guess the question here is, they've had all of these scandals where, as a group of people, they've shown to be heartless and really not care about their athletes, in so much as when it doesn't impact their bottom line, they're not going to do anything.
Right.
So the simple question here is, Nancy, is there anything the NFL can do to lose popularity?
I don't think so, because we have seen them tested by some really serious and really awful things. And even, I think back to the Ray Rice in 2014, and everybody was just so outraged, that the videos came out and it was just horrified. And you saw the NFL's Roger Goodell's indifference initially to it. And people were really disgusted. And yet we all still watch. We've heard the stories of players who've had CTE, players who've have died by suicide, some incredibly popular and famous names. And yet we continue to watch. It's our national pastime. I know the dark side of the game, every bit of it, and yet it's still my favorite sport to watch. And I have struggled with that. And I think a lot of Americans do, but at the same time, it's a game we cannot quit. And I don't ever see, if the things that have come up in the last decade or so couldn't threaten the NFL's popularity, I don't know if there's anything that can.
So, Nancy, when we're talking about how the popularity of the NFL enables abuses that are tolerated by the ownership, what we're really talking about is the consumer responsibility, right? Mm-hmm. We're shifting a little bit of the responsibility away from the owners and onto us, the viewers, and saying that our choices are helping compound the problem, because the popularity is what undergirds the success of the NFL. And if there's no changes or threats to the popularity of the NFL, there's no real reason to address any of these issues. Are you seeing in any quarters a change to consumer attitudes that will actually make an impact? Because we want to understand really what is our responsibility as consumers here as part of this picture.
Yeah, and had women taken a stand post Ray Rice, and there were a couple other incidents right around, in a row in between 2014 and 2016, had women taken a stand and said, we're not going to watch, maybe the NFL would have paid attention, but we didn't. There was when Kaepernick started protesting, there was a large segment of the population who said, I'm never watching the NFL again. I'm turning it off. I'm never watching it. TV numbers dipped briefly, better than ever now. So yeah, I mean, you can criticize the NFL all we want, and I know I do frequently, but yet we still watch. And you're right that the owners aren't compelled to do anything because they know that the game is Teflon. Nothing has been able to bring it down. Nothing has been able to rock it. And, even as awful as the Damar Hamlin injury was, it became a rallying point for people around the country, pray for Damar. So it really is fascinating to watch that. It's kind of like in some ways, it's almost like a family member. Like, we know the flaws, we know the good, bad, and the ugly, but we love it just the same. And we're going to stick by it no matter what happens. So yeah, I mean, when we criticize the NFL, when we talk about the bad things, sure, fans have a large role to play in that. And I think we've spoken, and I'm saying we, all of us, because we haven't turned it off. We continue to watch. And so as much as we might care about some of these issues, not enough to shake our love for the NFL.
And I'm as big a hypocrite as anybody before any of our listeners are scratching their heads thinking, why am I being tough on football? I named my dog after Tom Brady left New England and went to Tampa. I'm a New England fan. I named my dog Brady after Sir Thomas Patrick Edward Brady. So I watched this stuff. I'm never going to quit it. And I just wanted that out there.
Well, I mean, I think that in so many areas where consumer responsibility or initiative could make an impact, it's so difficult. I mean, think about Apple and iPhones. We hear about sweatshops for clothing as well. And as consumers, it's almost impossible to really look at every product that we're using and make an ethical choice. Nancy, what I want to ask you next, and it's a bit of a challenging question, but often in areas where there's corporate responsibility and consumers can't or won't make an impact, this is where the government might step in, where we might look to public policy solutions. It's exactly kind of the recipe for intervention. I'm wondering, is there any kind of public policy solution to some of the things we're talking about, especially in regard to player health?
Yeah, there have been congressional committees that have taken a look at it. There have been congressional committees that have zeroed in on owners, Daniel Snyder obviously being one of them right now. But members of Congress are just like us too. And they might like headlines. They also don't want to piss off the people they represent, who are NFL fans as well. I mean, they know that what the mood of the public is. The NFL also has a lot of very, very well-paid lawyers, very, very well-paid lobbyists. No, I mean, you might be able to push them a little bit here and there on player health, player safety, especially, after something catastrophic happens. But if things didn't shake the NFL over this last decade, 2 decades, I honestly don't know if anything will.
The views expressed by Mr. Sterling are deeply offensive, and harmful. That they came from an NBA owner only heightens the damage and my personal outrage. Effective immediately, I am banning Mr. Sterling for life from any association with the Clippers organization or the NBA. Mr. Sterling may not attend any NBA games or practices. He may not be present at any Clippers facility, and he may not participate in any business or player personnel decisions involving the team. I am also fining Mr. Sterling $2.5 million, the maximum amount allowed under the NBA Constitution. These funds will be donated to organizations dedicated to anti-discrimination and tolerance efforts that will be jointly selected by the NBA and its Players Association. As for Mr. Sterling's ownership interest in the Clippers, I will urge the Board of Governors to exercise its authority to force a sale of the team, and will do everything in my power to ensure that that happens.
In the NBA, we saw, and I want to focus on these owners. In the NBA, we saw, I believe it was 2 instances where the group of owners said, okay, this is way too far. We all know the Donald Sterling incident.
Mm-hmm.
For the listeners, he was the owner of the LA Clippers. He was recorded saying these vile, racist things.
Yep.
And it felt like there was almost a player revolt. And then he was forced to sell. Robert Sarver, Suns, I guess you'd call it losing institutional control of the organization, with some racism obviously thrown in, because those tend to go hand in hand. And he was forced to sell. Can we look at the NFL? And I know there's Jerry Richardson, the Panthers, but I want to get into just very quickly Dan Snyder, and then maybe we can turn the tables to some positive topics. But this is a gentleman who has been alleged to steal deposits from the fans for season tickets. He's been alleged to create an environment that is conducive to sexual harassment, maybe assault, and partake in those terrible misdeeds. And it took the NFL, I think he's been an owner since 95. So it took them a while to get to this point where they're starting to ratchet up the pressure. Is there any chance that the NFL owners say enough is enough? And if they do, why do you think they would in this situation when they've let so much slide?
Yeah. And don't forget the racist nickname of the team that he held on to for dear life until the sponsors forced him to change it. I think this time is different. And I don't think you are going to see, I'll backtrack. When Jim Irsay from the Indianapolis Colts came out after the owners meeting, I believe it was in the fall, early fall, and was pretty pointed in his comments about Snyder, basically saying, I don't know if he belongs in the NFL. Jim Irsay has a very troubled history himself, addiction issues, DUIs, but that's all out in the open. So, if there were fears about Dan Snyder having dirt or trying to, spy on his fellow owners, you can't do that with Irsay because all the stuff's already out there. So he was kind of the perfect person to send out there and convey the feelings of the NFL ownership. I don't think it's going to be, and it hasn't been as public as Sterling, that, you're not going to see the owners lining up and saying, okay, Dan, you need to sell. I think there's been pressure from behind the scenes. I think when Jerry Jones says it might be best for him to go, and almost making it sound like this is the best thing for Dan, that, for his health and well-being, that he should sell. But, when that happens, I think the writing is on the wall. Now, will he sell a full control or will he sell a share? That remains to be seen. And why any of this would be happening is the NFL owners care about money. And if you are threatening their fatted calf, they don't take kindly to that. And that is the one thing that is going to get them to act. So you've seen sponsors, that was what forced him to change the nickname, was when the sponsors said, we don't want to be part of this. You've got enough really disgusting and despicable things that have happened with the Washington football team and with Dan Snyder, his own involvement, that I think sponsors have been like, this isn't great. I don't know that I want to be associated with this. He can't get a stadium deal in Maryland, Virginia, or the district, which is shocking because if pretty much any other owner just mentions the word new stadium and politicians are falling all over themselves to give him money. So Snyder's costing his fellow owners money, and that's when you're going to lose support. So do I think there's going to be, an out and out or public revolt against him? No, but I think there's probably efforts behind the scenes. And, we saw that when he announced that he was looking at ways to sell the team or had engaged a group to examine offers. But like I said, we don't know if that is fully selling the team or if he's going to be bringing on additional partners.
What's interesting here to me, Nancy, is that a sale is sort of a strange form of justice, because the real consequence of that is that this owner, the controversial, criticized figure,
he gets a whole lot of money,
is going to make billions and billions of dollars. I mean, this was especially the case in those NBA situations, because the value of the team had appreciated so much since those owners first bought them. And so Donald Sterling's punishment was that he was going to get a return on his investment of a factor of 20, bought a team for $200,000 and sold it for $4 billion. That's not a factor of 20. Please don't consider my math here. But you understand the point that I'm making, that, we force a sale to get justice for the transgressions of these owners. And it really is just a huge benefit to them. I looked at the case of Chelsea Football Club over in the UK, where when Roman Abramovich was being sanctioned and penalized, they forced him to move the asset into a trust so that he couldn't benefit financially from the sale. Arguably, the financial situation in that league is shadier and worse than in the United States in general. But when they did take action, they took action in a much more dramatic and effective way than we've even begun to consider in these cases here in the United States.
Yeah, but I think one of the differences that all of these owners are kind of looking at Snyder and thinking, well, there, but for the grace of God, go I. Maybe they're not as awful human beings as Snyder is, but they all have skeletons in their closet and they don't want them to come out. So they're not going to push too hard because they don't want somebody coming after them. And I think also, too, these guys, yes, it is gross that you're going to get paid however many $1 billion to walk away. But the thing is with these guys, they love the money, obviously, but they also like being part of this very exclusive club. So, it's going to kill Snyder to not be the owner of an NFL team. I mean, this is what he's wanted since he was a boy. And to not be part of this very, very, you could argue, most exclusive club in the country, to no longer be part of that is going to crush him. They just want to own an NFL team. They don't have to live in the same city. They don't have to live in the same state even. They just want to be an NFL owner. So I think that's why you see a little bit different, the way that it's handled here, that it wouldn't be handled like Abramovich was with Chelsea.
And his mismanagement, I live in Washington, D.C. I've put a deposit down for season tickets. I'm shameless. I love the NFL. His mismanagement, Nancy, it's everything that we discussed, down to there was a player that died, Sean Taylor. They did a monument for him. They made a big deal of it. I went to see the monument.
Oh, my God, it's so bad.
I don't even know how to describe it. It's worse than you would think it's going to be this statue, right? This granite or, concrete statue. What is it? Like a mannequin?
It looks like a mannequin that is modeling a jersey in a Dick's Sporting Goods. I mean, except it's larger. The only thing probably more embarrassing is the Cristiano Ronaldo bust, just because that face is just so hideous. But it's embarrassing. And how you do that to an icon of that team is just, it kind of sums up everything about Dan Snyder and the Washington football team, which I still call him that because I think that's the best name ever. And it makes me sad that they didn't keep that one.
It's a lot better than the Commanders. I will say that.
Yeah. But it's like, you almost have to try. Like, there's part of me that wonders, does he sit around at night and think, okay, how many different ways can I be a dick? Like, what else can I do that's going to piss people off? Because it almost seemed that, like, if you were a normal person, you wouldn't do really any of the stuff that he does. But yet he does, time and again.
And Nancy, it's you could argue it's one of the crown jewels of any sports league in Washington, D.C., a major city, the seat of power of the world, arguably. And this guy's stadium, the speakers didn't work in the club section I sat in. It's all falling apart. It's gross paint. It's absolutely disgusting. And it's shocking. It really shocks you when you go from somewhere like New England or, Las Vegas or wherever you want to mention. and there's just a minimal amount of care to this dump in Washington, D.C., and this guy is still allowed to represent the league where all the politicians watch these games. It's shocking.
At least 2 people are dead in connection to a major storm that dumped snow across western and northern New York State. Parts of Buffalo were blanketed Friday. Some areas could be covered in more than 4 feet of snow by Sunday. A state of emergency is in effect for 11 counties. In South Buffalo, residents are under a driving ban.
Because Friday they had to cancel practice, and Friday when I talked to people inside the Bills, they were questioning even if they were going to be able to get out yesterday. And the reason why, 77 inches of snow fell on Orchard Park this past weekend. And man, listen, Buffalo's just a different place. It was a community effort. People in the neighborhoods were just coming out with snowplows. They were digging players out of their driveway to be able to get them, to be able to get on their plane. They finally got to Detroit last night. They were absolutely exhausted. We talked about how special the city of Buffalo is. So is Bills Mafia, because 56,000 tickets went on sale within 24 hours. Those were all sold to Bills Mafia, to the point where Kevin Stefanski saying, I got to use a silent snap count, even in Detroit.
Kels, Ryan, I mean, the whole office, man, it took a lot of to get us here. When you get home, pay those fans some respect, get them something nice, man, treat them well, because that was awesome to see. It took a lot of to get here. That could have drained us and it didn't.
Everyone back in Buffalo who's currently digging out, again, we're thinking of you guys, and that was for you.
It's an honor and a privilege to be a part of that community.
They love us and we love them, and they came to get us.
So it's nice to give them something to, be happy about.
And that's love. I mean, you can't get no better than that.
I did want to try and turn into why we watch the sport and what it actually means to Americans. So, Nancy, when I drive into a Washington football team game, I see all of these folks tailgating, and it almost feels like somewhat of a religion to me. I was hoping that you could kind of describe the game day feel of your average fan and where it ranks for them in, their life, what they're spending their money on, their time, with their friends, and give us some of the positive of the sport.
Yeah, I think for a lot of us, it's religion, tradition, family. It's all of those things. I think most of us, unless you came over, like you didn't grow up in the States, I think most of us grew up being introduced to all of our sports, but the NFL in particular by an important family member or an important family friend. Like I'm a sports writer today because I grew up watching Packer games with my dad every Sunday, stretched out on the floor watching the Packers, and God, were they awful when I was a kid. But we watched every single Sunday. And so my love of the NFL isn't just about the game itself. It's about those Sundays with my dad. It's about the memories of, asking him questions, of asking how Bart Starr could have been such a fantastic player and such a bad coach. Like, that's what the game represents to me. And I think, for all of us, it's something we all have in common. It's something we all agree on. Doesn't matter your politics, doesn't matter where you're from, doesn't matter how much money you make. You go to a game and you're out tailgating. You could be tailgating next to a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, or you could be tailgating next to a fast food worker, somebody who's making minimum wage. It doesn't matter. We have this one thing in common. Tribal might be the word that I was looking for before. We don't have many things like that anymore. And so I think we hang on to it because we crave it. I don't think anybody likes the divisiveness that there is these days. I don't think people like feeling detached. And so we crave these moments or these things that we have in common and that we have the shared love for. There are people, like you can go to a game and be walking on a concourse or walking through the parking lot, and people you might never talk to just because you don't talk to people just in general. And you can have these wild discussions about, is so-and-so going to start? And, do you think that they can keep Patrick Mahomes from throwing 5 touchdowns today? There's, like I said, there's a commonality and there's a joy, a hope, or whatever that everybody can have a piece of, that everybody can identify with. And I think that's what we love. And that's, and also too, the game is fun, fast, interesting, vivid, colorful, whatever adjectives you want to use. But I do think it's the commonality and that shared experience, that shared thing that keeps us tuning in.
Nancy, when we were preparing for this program, we were also thinking a lot about the value of the NFL in particular and the Super Bowl in particular as probably the only remaining unifying cultural event in the United States. Frequent listeners of the program will know that I used to work in television, so I'm interested in television viewership as a way of measuring what's universal and popular. And seeing the trends over time, it's so remarkable how, spread out the entertainment and cultural landscape has become. A few decades ago, we only had 3 television channels, the 3 networks, and now we've got hundreds plus streaming on demand. Back in the 1980s, there was a time in which one episode of the show MASH, the final episode of MASH in 1983, received 106 million viewers in the United States. And again, this was in the 1980s when the U.S. population was smaller than it is now. So 106 million viewers for one episode of television. Last year, the most viewed single episode of television was an episode of Yellowstone, which is not even on network television, and it received 12.6 million. So that's the difference between 106 million and 12 million. Think about how spread out the viewership has become, where we don't have entertainment products that have universal appeal. But when we look at what is still broadly popular in America, there's only one thing, and that's the NFL. Yep. And looking again at this viewership, we see that the top 8 most viewed programs in the United States last year, 1 through 8, are all NFL broadcasts.
Yeah.
And number 9 is a college football match. Mm-hmm. And then it's more NFL. It's really the only, Nancy, can you think of any other institution that has that broad appeal in American life?
No. And I think it's a really good comparison is when you look at the Oscars and the Grammys. The Grammys were just last night, which I didn't even know about until I got an alert on my phone midday about, the Grammys broadcast tonight. I'm like, really? Whereas I think almost everybody can tell you that the Super Bowl is Sunday because you see the ads. People are talking about having Super Bowl parties. It goes beyond sport. It's a cultural moment. Even people who don't care about the NFL, they'll go to a Super Bowl party because their friends are all there. They want to watch the commercials. They want to talk about the commercials. They want to eat the food. So it goes beyond the game. And it goes back to what I was saying before, that there's this commonality that you can't create it. It just happens. And it's, I think at this point it's embedded in our culture. It's not something that, I think if the NFL had to start over from scratch, I don't know that they could get it to what it is right now. But yeah, it's the one thing that people are all going to watch. If you don't like football, maybe you just want to see Rihanna or whoever is the Super Bowl halftime act. Like I said, you want to see the commercials. Like, are the Clydesdales going to be back this year? Is Bruce Springsteen going to make a random appearance like he did 2 years ago? There is something, at least with the Super Bowl, there is something for everybody. Doesn't matter if you're a football fan or not. If you're a diehard, a casual, not at all. There's something on that day for everybody.
I just want to provide another number to illustrate this again. And this is another fascinating one. I hope that people who are listening are going to bear with me here. But again, looking at how the popularity of these cultural events has just disappeared. The highest grossing movie of all time by ticket sales, unadjusted, is Star Wars Episode 7, $900 million. If you do inflation adjusted ticket sales to try to measure over time what was really the most popular movie, it's still Gone with the Wind, which made $1.9 billion, more than twice as much.
Wow.
So back in the 1930s, a popular movie could sell twice as many tickets as any movie does today. And it's interesting looking at that particular example because we can see how Gone with the Wind's reputation over time as a unifying cultural product has been degraded by the kind of, for the lack of a better word, problematic political aspects of that piece of work. And Nancy, all of what we've been talking about tonight is observing that the same thing might actually be happening with this only product that we have left as unifying cultural product, the NFL. And I'm wondering, Nancy, if you observe that political figures are hastening the decline of the NFL as a non-politicized, universal cultural institution by seizing opportunities to score partisan points off of any potential controversy around the NFL. I'm thinking about things like the vice president, Mike Pence, flying to an NFL game, just to stage a protest.
Yeah.
Are you worried that we are chipping away at the kind of universal aspects of this institution unnecessarily?
I don't think so. I was curious to see what was going to happen in 2016 and 2017. And I think by 2018, it pretty much dissipated, because you did have the politicians lambasting the NFL. You had some conservative fans saying, I'm never going to watch the NFL again. But really by 2018, the numbers were rebounding. And if you look at the TV numbers this season, they're better than ever. If you look at attendance, still sky high. And you're seeing that in other sports that people might not be going as much, going in attendance because the viewing experience at home is better. You don't see that with the NFL unless you've got a god-awful team like Washington. People are still going to these games. They're still spending an inordinate amount of money on the tickets, on the parking, on the hot dogs, on the beer, et cetera. Jersey sales are still huge. And, even the loss of now Tom Brady is retired, Aaron Rodgers might be, but, if it's not this year, it's going to be coming soon. But you now have these other young quarterbacks like a Patrick Mahomes, a Josh Allen, a Jalen Hurts, a Trevor Lawrence, who it's still exciting. There's not a drop off in the excitement level of the game and of the talent level and of the watchability factor. So no, I don't think the political divisiveness or the politics of our country, it looked like it might have an impact at one point, but that has really gone away. And you see that the politicians who were criticizing the NFL are not anymore. When's the last time you heard a politician say anything critical of the NFL? It's been a while.
I recently heard some right-wing podcasts, I'm not going to name them. They were, on the front lines during the George Floyd protests, lambasting the NFL. Now their tune is how Democrats are wussies for caring about head trauma. And now they're the biggest NFL defenders because of what you said. It's like Teflon and NFL. I wanted to ask you a question. Now, you give me my choice. I'm taking a home playoff baseball game over anything. I think that it's just magical where you can go from 0 to 100 in one pitch. You can slowly build over the course of half an hour with the pitcher losing his mind on the mound, and the crowd slowly builds and the roar, and that the game could be just decided on this one pitch in the first inning. So my passion is with baseball. But one of the criticisms, Nancy, with baseball is that it's too long. It's too slow. It's just not made for Gen Z in our society today. But the NFL, Nancy, these games are going 3 hours, 45 minutes, 4 hours. What is it about the sport that can keep people captivated for such a long period of time when even myself, it's hard for me not to look at Twitter, every 10 minutes?
It's still bite-sized. I think this was several years ago, but I think it was right after DirecTV came out with the Red Zone, that they eliminated all of the dead space in a game, whether it was commercials, timeouts, time between plays. And I think it came down to like the actual action in the game was, I want to say like 20 minutes or 40 minutes, something, a very, very small number when you compare it to a 3 or 3.5 hour game. But because of that, because of the stops and the starts, you don't have to be paying attention for that whole time. You can be looking at Twitter because either you're not going to miss something or you're going to see it replayed on Twitter or whatever social media site you're following.
I watched 3 games at once, so I can relate to that. I was kind of tongue in cheek, but I do love myself some playoff baseball. Good pitchers duel. And Philadelphia was just magical.
I think the winner take all of the NFL playoffs, I think also helps versus Major League Baseball and even the NBA too, because you might have this magical game in baseball. It doesn't necessarily, in the grand scheme of things, it might not mean anything. Whereas if you lose in the NFL, you're done. So I think that, that kind of high stakesness of it lends to the appeal of it.
That's another great point. And before we get to the predictions on the Super Bowl, we'd be remiss if we didn't ask a USA Today sports columnist for their predictions. Maybe I can throw some greenbacks on your answer. You mentioned the Packers, so I got to assume they're one of your favorite teams. Being a sports columnist for such a renowned outlet, Is it difficult to put your personal feelings aside on the teams that you're writing an article about? And how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I think when you get into this business, you lose the fandom pretty quickly. Like, especially if you cover a team, you see the players, you're never going to know them. Like we always say that you can never know who these guys really are, but you might see things that don't exactly square with their public persona. And so that kind of turns it off. But also too, you just, when you're writing a gamer, you have to be clinical about it or objective about it. So you root for the story. John, you probably know this from TV. You really are rooting for yourself. Like you want a game that's going to end in time to make deadline. You want a good storyline. You don't want weather delays or extra innings or anything like that, because that's going to screw up your deadline, and it's going to, you're not going to get out until 3 a.m. You want guys who are going to come out of the showers quickly so you can talk them in the locker room and get back up and finish writing your story. So that all kind of takes out the fandom that you had as a kid. I tend to root more for, I don't even want to say necessarily players, but good stories. I think everybody in the world would be rooting for, if he would come back and play, I think everybody would be rooting for DeMar Hamlin just because of everything that happened. So it's really not that hard to put that aside. And in fact, my friends kind of get mad. Like if I'm watching a game with them, they're like, "You don't cheer." I'm like, "No, I don't. I'm watching the game, and this is how I watch a game now." So,
Nancy, talking about the teams that are good for journalists to cover and trickier for journalists to cover because of access, facilities, and so on, kind of as you've been describing. I had a colleague who worked on TV broadcasts in the Premier League, and he talked about how Man United always made it a great experience for journalists. They made sure the players were ready for interviews, great facilities for the journalists, access was great. And then Chelsea were the opposite. They were extremely difficult for journalists to cover. Maybe you're not at liberty to really give us a direct answer. At least you could tell us about which teams in the NFL are good for journalists to cover. I mean, we're talking about how owners responsibly run their organization, so I think it's a fitting thing maybe to comment on.
Yeah, and it really depends on the PR staff. The Kansas City Chiefs are tremendous to deal with. Their PR staff is great. Andy Reid is really good. Their guys talk. It's not, they might have one day a week or whatever, but they make it easier to do our jobs. Let's see, who's bad?
I think there's an obvious one. Is it the Patriots?
Thought it was going to be Washington.
Well, I mean, Washington. Yeah, no, then their PR staff is awful. And I remember one time, I went up to try and talk to Snyder and I got yelled at by their PR guy. I'm like, dude, he's not a king. I don't care. Whatever. But yeah, they make it difficult. And, even something as simple as, a lot of teams will provide parking for journalists, especially if you're coming in from out of town. I'm pretty sure the parking lot at FedEx Field is in West Virginia. I think I walked like a mile to it after the last game that I covered there.
Oh my goodness. So Nancy, last question then, and this will truly be the last question. We are going to release this discussion on Thursday, right before the Super Bowl. So we have to ask you for predictions and what else to expect.
I find it very hard to bet against Patrick Mahomes. I think, if he could win that game on one leg, basically, now he's got 2 weeks to get healthy, or has had 2 weeks to get healthy. He's so dynamic. And Justin, you might have to get another dog and name him for Patrick, because I think if there's anybody who could pass Brady or surpass Brady as the best quarterback of all time, greatest quarterback of all time, it's going to be Mahomes. He's just so mesmerizing to watch. And, I know that his receivers at the start of the season, there were a lot of questions about them because they were young, but they've really come into their own, especially late in the season. Travis Kelce is just, I don't know how anybody can cover him. And I think Kansas City's defense is not as good as it might have been in some past years, but I think it's good enough. They've also been there before. You do have some people on the Eagles who were on their last Super Bowl team, but I think the Chiefs remind me a lot of the Patriots during the dynasty days in terms of they know how to win. They know what to do in these games. And so, yeah, my prediction is Chiefs. And I'm going to say 35-24.
Well, Nancy, I really enjoyed our conversation up until that last answer. So
sorry, didn't mean to rub it in.
No, but thank you very much for a fantastic discussion. And we're looking forward to catching your next column in the USA Today.
Well, thanks. This was a fun discussion. Glad to have done it.